The turkey hadn't even been carved yet when my father pointed at the door and told me to get out of the house. "Dead weight," he said loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. "That's all you've ever been." The room went silent. You could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My brother Tom stopped halfway through pouring himself another glass of wine. My mother stared down at her plate like the mashed potatoes suddenly needed studying. My father leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms and nodded toward the front door. "If you're so tough," he said, "then leave." He expected tears, maybe an apology, maybe the same quiet retreat I'd given him 100 times before over the years. Instead, I picked up my glass, took a slow sip, and set it down. Then I said calmly, "Dad, this house isn't yours anymore." For a moment, nobody breathed. Tom blinked at me like he'd misheard. My Aunt Carol actually gasped. Even my father's confident little smirk froze halfway on his face. But that moment right there at the Thanksgiving table didn't come out of nowhere. It had been building for 40 years. Thanksgiving had always been my mother's favorite holiday. She loved the rituals of it, the smell of sage stuffing baking in the oven, the old radio in the kitchen playing soft country music, the table set with the same brown plates she'd bought back in 1978. This year looked the same as every other year. But something underneath it had changed. I'd driven back to my hometown that morning, the same small Ohio town where I'd grown up. Population barely 8,000. The kind of place where the high school football field lights could be seen from almost every street. The old streets looked smaller than I remembered. I parked 2 houses down from my parents' place and sat in the car for a minute before going inside. The house itself looked exactly the same. White siding, a porch swing my father built back when I was 10, wind chimes hanging beside the door that my mother refused to replace even though they'd been rusting for years. I'd spent a lot of my childhood on that porch, and a lot of my adulthood trying to forget it. I finally stepped out of the car and walked up the driveway. Before I could knock, the door opened and my mother pulled me into a hug. "Sarah," she said softly, "you made it." She smelled like cinnamon and laundry soap. "I wouldn't miss Thanksgiving," I said. Inside the house buzzed with the noise of relatives talking over each other. Tom was already there, leaning against the kitchen counter with a beer in his hand like he owned the place, which in his mind he probably did. Tom was 3 years older than me, taller, louder, the kind of guy who had always believed the world would eventually sort itself out in his favor. Growing up, my father called him the future of the family. Me? I was just the daughter who left. Tom grinned when he saw me. "Well, look who decided to show up," he said, "the Marine." I nodded. "Good to see you too, Tom." I'd retired from the Marine Corps the year before, 22 years of service, logistics officer, mostly behind-the-scenes work, but work that mattered. Not that my father ever thought so. He walked in from the living room a few minutes later. Frank Miller, 72 years old, broad shoulders that had shrunk with age but still carried the same stubborn pride. When he saw me, he didn't smile. "You're late," he said. "Dinner's not until 4, I replied. "Still late?" That was my father's version of hello. Dinner started out the way it always did. The turkey was placed in the center of the table, steam curled up from the stuffing. My mother insisted everyone hold hands for grace. My father said the prayer. His voice carried the same authority it always had. But somewhere halfway through dinner, things shifted. It started when my aunt asked me about retirement. "So what do you do now, Sarah?" she said. "Mostly consulting," I answered. "Logistics, planning for a transportation company." Tom snorted. "Sounds fancy," he said. "But let's be honest, the military pays pretty good pensions, doesn't it?" I shrugged. "It's comfortable." My father cut into his turkey and said, "Comfortable for sitting around, maybe." Nobody laughed. He wiped his mouth with a napkin. "You know," he continued, "Tom's the one who's been here taking care of things all these years." Tom nodded proudly. My father gestured toward the house. Bills, repairs, keeping the place running. I knew that wasn't true. But I stayed quiet. Then he looked directly at me. "And you just drift back into town whenever you feel like it." I set my fork down. "I've helped when it mattered," I said. Tom leaned back in his chair. "Helped," he said. "You mean sending a birthday card once a year?" My father chuckled. And then he said the words, "Dead weight." Just like that. "Tom's been carrying this family," my father said. You've been dead weight for years." The words hung in the air. My mother whispered, "Frank." But he wasn't finished. He pointed toward the front door. If you're so tough, he said, then leave. He leaned back, waiting for the same thing he'd always expected from me. Submission. Instead, I took a sip of wine, looked around the table, and said calmly, "Dad, this house isn't yours anymore." The silence that followed felt like winter moving through the room. Tom laughed first. It wasn't a nervous laugh. It was the kind he'd used his whole life whenever something sounded ridiculous. "Good one, Sarah," he said, shaking his head. "You always did like drama." My father didn't laugh. He stared at me across the Thanksgiving table with that same hard expression he'd worn for most of my life. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I folded my napkin slowly and set it beside my plate. Years in the Marine Corps teach you patience in moments like that. You learn not to rush a conversation that's already going to change everything. Around us, nobody moved. My Aunt Carol looked like she wasn't sure whether to leave the table or stay frozen in place. My mother kept staring down at the gravy boat like it held the answer to a question she didn't want asked. Tom leaned forward. "Seriously," he said, "what are you talking about?" I looked at him. Exactly what I said. My father pushed his chair back an inch, the wood scraping against the floor. "This is my house," he said flatly. The words carried the same certainty he'd used my entire childhood. When my father said something, it was supposed to be the final word. But things had changed. "Dad," I said quietly, "when's the last time you checked the county records?" Tom frowned. "What does that even mean?" I stood up from the table and walked over to the sideboard near the kitchen doorway. I'd left my coat there earlier that afternoon. Inside the coat pocket was a plain manila envelope. I carried it back to the table. Nobody spoke while I opened it. Inside were several documents neatly folded, the official kind, the kind with county stamps and signatures. I placed them gently on the table in front of my father. He didn't touch them at first. Tom leaned over to see. "What is that?" he asked. "Paperwork," I said. My father finally reached forward and picked up the top page. He read the first line. Then the second. His jaw tightened. Tom snatched the document from his hands. "Let me see that." He scanned the page quickly, then again slower. "What the hell is this?" he said. "It's the deed transfer," I replied. Tom looked up sharply. "You're joking." Number. The room had gone so quiet that the refrigerator humming in the kitchen sounded louder than usual. My father spoke again, but his voice had changed. "Explain," he said. So I did. But to understand how we got to that moment at the Thanksgiving table, you have to go back a few months earlier. Back to a phone call that came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at the small kitchen table in my apartment in Columbus when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from my hometown. I almost didn't answer. After 22 years in the Marine Corps, you get used to certain calls bringing bad news, but retirement had slowly taught me that life could be quieter. Still, something about that number made me pick up. "Hello? Is this Sarah Miller?" the woman asked. "Yes. My name is Diane Carter. I'm calling from the county clerk's office." Her voice was polite but careful. "I'm contacting you regarding a property connected to your family." My stomach tightened. "What property?" "The residence at 214 Maple Street. My parents' house." "What about it?" I asked. There was a pause on the line. "Are you aware there is currently a foreclosure process underway?" The words landed like a brick. "No," I said slowly, "there must be some mistake." "I'm afraid there isn't." She explained it piece by piece. A second mortgage. Missed payments. Legal notices that had already been sent. If the debt wasn't resolved soon, the house would be auctioned. I sat there gripping the phone while she spoke. "But my parents," I started. "They are listed as occupants," she said gently. "However, the loan paperwork indicates your brother Thomas Miller signed the agreement." I closed my eyes. "Tom." "Of course." Tom had always been good at sounding confident when he asked for money. When we were kids, he convinced my father to co-sign loans for motorcycles, business ideas, and at least 3 pickup trucks. Every time something failed, my father said the same thing. "Tom just needs another chance." Now the chances had finally run out. "When is the auction?" I asked. 30 days, she said. 30 days. 30 days before the house my parents had lived in for 40 years disappeared. After the call ended, I sat there for a long time. Outside my apartment window, traffic moved along the street. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the hall. Life was continuing like normal. But in that moment, my family's entire history sat on a ticking clock. I drove back to Maple Street that weekend. The house looked exactly the same as always. My father was out in the garage when I arrived. He had the old radio playing baseball highlights while he worked on a lawnmower. "Didn't expect to see you," he said when I walked in. "Just visiting." He wiped his hands on a rag. "Tom told me he's got some big investment thing going," my father said proudly. "Real estate opportunity." I didn't respond. Inside the house, my mother was folding laundry. "Your brother's really stepping up lately," she said softly. I looked around the kitchen. The cracked linoleum floor. The faded curtains. Every corner of that house carried a memory. And none of them deserved to end in a bank auction. That night I sat in my car down the street and did the math. Retirement savings. VA benefits. A little consulting money. It wasn't an easy decision. But it was the right one. 2 weeks later I attended the county foreclosure auction. The room smelled like cheap coffee and old paperwork. Most of the people there were investors hoping to flip properties. When the address 214 Maple Street was announced, my heart pounded harder than it had in years. The bidding didn't last long. I raised my hand once. Then again. Finally, the auctioneer slammed his gavel. Sold. Just like that. The house stayed in the family. Only nobody knew it yet. Back at the Thanksgiving table, Tom looked at the documents again like they might suddenly change. "You bought the house," he said. "Yes." "That's insane." My father hadn't said anything. He was staring at the deed transfer like it was written in a language he couldn't understand. "Dad," I said gently, "the bank was going to take it." The clock in the hallway ticked again. Finally, my father spoke. But his voice sounded older than it had an hour earlier. "You're saying I almost lost the house?" "Yes." Tom pushed his chair back abruptly. "That's not the whole story," he said. But it was. And deep down, everyone at that table knew it. Tom pushed his chair back so suddenly the legs scraped across the wooden floor. "That's not the whole story," he said sharply. His voice carried that familiar edge I'd heard since we were kids. Tom had always believed he could talk his way out of anything if he spoke loud enough. My father looked from him to me confused. "What whole story?" he asked. Tom grabbed the papers again and flipped through them as if searching for something that might prove me wrong. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "Dad and Mom own this place." "They did," I said calmly. My mother finally lifted her head. "What do you mean?" did she ask quietly. I met her eyes. "Mom, the house was used as collateral for a loan." She blinked slowly. "A loan." Tom slammed the paperwork down on the table. "That was temporary," he snapped. The word temporary hung in the air like smoke. My father frowned. "Tom," he said, "what loan?" Tom rubbed his forehead. "Dad, it's nothing. Just business financing. I told you about the investment property." "You told me you needed help with closing costs," my father replied. Tom shifted in his chair. "Well, yeah, that too." The truth was creeping into the room whether he liked it or not. I leaned back slightly, giving him the space to talk. But Tom didn't. Instead, he turned toward me. "You had no right to interfere," he said. I let out a slow breath. The bank was about to foreclose. That was weeks away. 30 days, I said. Actually 28 when I got the call. My father's eyebrows pulled together. "What call?" he asked. So I explained. Not with anger, not with triumph, just the facts. The county clerk contacted me. They said the property had gone into default after several missed payments. My mother's hand moved to her chest. "Missed payments," she whispered. Tom stood up. "This is ridiculous," he said. "Sarah's blowing this way out of proportion." But nobody at the table looked convinced. My father slowly turned toward him. "Tom," he said, his voice low, "now did you put a second mortgage on this house?" Tom didn't answer immediately. He glanced at me, then at the paperwork, then at the floor. "Well," he started. That single word told the entire story. My father's face drained of color. "How much?" he asked. Tom hesitated. "Tom, 180,000. My Aunt Carol gasped. My mother closed her eyes. The number sat in the center of the table, heavier than the turkey platter. My father leaned back in his chair. $180,000, he repeated slowly. Tom rushed forward with explanations. It was an opportunity, Dad. The real estate market's been booming. I was going to flip 2 properties and triple the return. You said it was closing costs. Well, it started that way. My father's voice rose. So you risked this house for a gamble. It wasn't a gamble. But even Tom didn't sound convinced anymore. I watched my father carefully. Frank Miller had built his entire identity around being the man who kept this family stable. And in one quiet Thanksgiving dinner, he had just learned that stability had almost disappeared without him knowing. He looked down at the documents again. Then at me. You bought it, he said slowly. Yes. Why didn't you tell us? That question deserved an honest answer. Because you wouldn't have believed me. He stared at me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Across the table, Tom scoffed. Unbelievable, he muttered. You think you're some kind of hero now? I shook my head. Number. You embarrassed Dad in front of the whole family. I didn't bring it up, I said quietly. That landed. Because everyone at the table remembered exactly who had started the confrontation. Dead weight. My father rubbed his temples. The room felt smaller somehow. Finally, he spoke again. So the bank was going to take the house? Yes. And you stopped it? Yes. Tom crossed his arms. By stealing it. I looked directly at him. I bought it legally. You waited for the foreclosure. I waited until the bank seized the loan you couldn't pay. My voice stayed steady. 22 years in the Marine Corps had trained me well for tense rooms. You learn how to keep your tone calm even when emotions run high. Tom shook his head in disbelief. You could have come to me. Tom, I said gently, you stopped answering your phone 3 months ago. He didn't respond. Because he knew it was true. I had tried to reach him. Several times. The calls had gone straight to voicemail. My father slowly looked at his son. Tom, were you going to tell us about this? Tom opened his mouth. Then closed it again. Silence filled the dining room. Outside, the wind rustled the last leaves in the maple tree by the porch. My mother finally spoke. Her voice was small. We could have lost the house. Nobody answered. Because the truth had already been spoken. My father pushed his plate away. He hadn't eaten much. His appetite had disappeared somewhere between the turkey and the paperwork. He looked around the room slowly. At my aunt. At my mother. At Tom. Then finally at me. For the first time in my life, I saw uncertainty in his eyes. Frank Miller had always been certain about everything. Certain that Tom was the responsible one. Certain that I was the one who walked away. Certain that he understood his own family. Now the ground under those beliefs had shifted. You said the house isn't mine anymore, he said quietly. That's correct. Then whose is it? I met his gaze. Legally. Yes. It belongs to me. The word settled slowly. Not as an accusation. Just a fact. Tom laughed bitterly. Great, he said. So now the Marine gets to be landlord. That's not what this is about. Sure it isn't. My father raised his hand. Enough. The room fell silent again. He looked older than he had when dinner started. Finally, he spoke again. Sarah. Yes, Dad. Why would you spend your own money on this house? The question was simple. But the answer carried 40 years of history. I looked around the dining room. At the walls where my childhood photos still hung. At the hallway where my mother had measured our height every year with pencil marks. At the porch outside where my father once taught me how to ride a bike. Then I looked back at him. Because it's still home. Nobody spoke after that. The clock in the hallway ticked again. And for the first time that evening, my father looked down at the table instead of across it. For a long moment after I said it, nobody spoke. Because it's still home. Those 4 words sat quietly in the middle of the dining room, heavier than all the paperwork spread across the table. My father stared down at the deed again. Tom paced beside the table like a man trying to outrun a problem that had already caught him. My mother folded her hands together so tightly her knuckles turned pale. You should have told us, she said, finally, her voice soft. I tried, I replied. Tom stopped pacing. That's not true. I looked at him calmly. I called you 5 times in September. He didn't answer. You texted me once, he muttered. I texted you 3 times. My father's eyes moved slowly toward him. Tom. It wasn't that simple, Tom said quickly. I was working on fixing things. Fixing them how my father asked. Tom hesitated. Well, refinancing. The word sounded weak even to him. You already refinanced, I said. That was temporary. You said that earlier. Tom exhaled loudly. Look, markets change. Deals fall through. That happens. My father leaned forward. You risked this house, he said slowly, for a deal. It was supposed to save us money. By borrowing $180,000. Tom rubbed his face with both hands. You wouldn't understand. The room stiffened. My father had spent 30 years working at the steel plant before it closed down in the early 90s. He understood debt better than most people. He understood what it meant to lose something you built. That's enough, he said quietly. Tom threw up his hands. Oh, come on, Dad, now you're taking her side. My father didn't answer. Because the truth was sitting on the table in black ink and county stamps. For the first time in my life, Tom looked unsure of himself. Growing up, my brother always moved through life like he expected doors to open automatically. When they didn't, he blamed the door. Or the lock. Or whoever built the hallway. Responsibility had never been his favorite subject. My father turned back toward me. You bought the house at auction, he said. Yes. How much? Less than the loan balance. Tom scoffed again. Of course you did. Banks love selling houses cheap. That's how foreclosure works, I said. My father nodded slowly, still absorbing everything. Did you plan to tell us? Yes. When? After dinner? Tom barked out a laugh. Oh, sure, very dramatic. It wasn't meant to be. But the moment had arrived sooner than expected. Dead weight. The words still echoed in the room. My father leaned back and looked around the table. Thanksgiving dinner had gone cold. The turkey sat half-carved. The gravy had formed a thin skin on top. It felt like the whole house had paused in the middle of a breath. Finally, my Aunt Carol cleared her throat. Well, she said awkwardly, at least the house is safe. Tom turned on her. Safe, he snapped. Sarah just took it from the family. I shook my head. That's not what happened. Really? Because that's exactly what it looks like. My father held up his hand again. Tom. His voice had changed. It wasn't angry anymore. It was tired. I need to understand something, he said. Tom crossed his arms. What? Were you ever going to tell us? Tom didn't answer. And that silence said more than any explanation he could have given. My father slowly nodded. Then he turned toward me again. You said the bank called you. Yes. Why you? I was listed as an emergency contact from an old loan you took out years ago, I explained. The clerk said my number was still in the file. My father rubbed his forehead. So a stranger at the courthouse cared enough to warn you? Yes. And my own son didn't. Tom shifted uncomfortably. You're making it sound worse than it was. How could it be worse, my father asked. Tom didn't respond. My mother finally spoke again. Frank, she said gently, let's not fight tonight. He looked at her. Then at the rest of us. Thanksgiving had always been his favorite holiday too, though he'd never admitted it. It was the one day every year when the family sat together. And now that picture had cracked. Sarah, he said quietly, what happens now? The question surprised Tom. What do you mean, what happens, he said. She gives it back. My father ignored him. He kept looking at me. I took a breath before answering. The house is legally mine, I said. Tom threw up his hands again. There it is. But I continued calmly, I didn't buy it to throw you out. My mother looked up quickly. You didn't... Number. Tom frowned. Then what was the point? I looked around the room. At the worn wooden cabinets. At the faded wallpaper my mother still loved. At the window above the sink where I used to watch snowstorms roll across the yard when I was a kid. This house has been in our family for 40 years, I said. My father nodded slowly. I know. I wasn't going to let a bank take it. Tom laughed bitterly again. So now what, we pay rent to you? My father shot him a look. That's enough. Tom muttered something under his breath but sat down. The room grew quiet again. I turned back toward my father. You and Mom can live here as long as you want, I said. My mother's eyes filled with tears. My father stared at me like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. You're not kicking us out, he asked. Of course not. Then why? I answered before he finished the question. Because someone had to stop the foreclosure. He nodded slowly. And for the first time that evening his voice softened. I didn't know. I know. Another long silence passed. Outside the porch, wind chimes rattled softly. Finally, my father pushed his chair back and stood. I need some air, he said. He walked toward the front door without looking at anyone. The screen door creaked when it closed behind him. Tom exhaled loudly. Well, he said that went great. My mother wiped her eyes. You should go talk to him, she said to me. I nodded. Because I knew this story wasn't really about the house anymore. It was about something older than that. Something that had been building between my father and me for most of my life. And for the first time, we were finally going to talk about it. The November air outside felt colder than it had an hour earlier. I stepped onto the porch and pulled my jacket tighter around me. The wind carried the faint smell of chimney smoke from somewhere down the street. A few houses away, someone's television drifted through an open window, the muffled sound of a football game mixing with the rustle of dry leaves. My father stood at the edge of the yard with his hands in his coat pockets. He was staring at the old maple tree beside the driveway. I remembered when he planted it. I had been 8 years old. Tom was 11. Dad said every house needed a tree that would outlive the people living there. Gives the place roots, he told us. Now the tree was taller than the roof. And the man who planted it suddenly looked smaller than I remembered. I walked down the porch steps slowly. He heard my footsteps but didn't turn around. For a minute we just stood there in silence. Finally he spoke. You always did like quiet exits. I almost smiled. Marine Corps training, I said. He nodded faintly. I guess you stayed longer than I expected. 22 years? That's a long time. Yes? Another silence. The wind moved through the branches above us. Then he said something I didn't expect. I didn't think you'd come back. I looked at him. Why not? He shrugged slightly. You left this town the first chance you got. That's true. You seemed happier away from it. That part wasn't entirely wrong. But it wasn't the whole story either. I didn't leave the town, I said. I left the expectations. He glanced at me. What expectations? I let out a quiet breath. The ones where Tom was always right and I was always extra. He looked back toward the house. You weren't extra. Dad, I said gently, you called me dead weight tonight. He flinched. Just slightly. But I saw it. I was angry, he muttered. You've been angry for 40 years. That landed harder. He shifted his weight on the gravel driveway. You think I don't know I've made mistakes, he said. I think you never noticed which ones mattered. The wind chimes on the porch clinked softly behind us. For a while neither of us spoke. Finally he asked the question that had been hanging over everything since dinner. Why didn't you tell me about the foreclosure when you found out? I had thought about that a lot over the past few months. I did think about calling you, I said. Why didn't you? Because I knew what you'd say. He frowned. What? That Tom had it under control. My father didn't answer. Because that's exactly what he would have said. He's your son, he said after a moment. So am I your daughter. The words were simple, but they hung in the cold air like something heavy finally spoken out loud. He rubbed the back of his neck. When you were kids, he said slowly, things were different. How? Well, boys carried the family name. I nodded. There it was. The old belief that had shaped most of my childhood. I remember, I said. You were always tougher than the other girls. I was tougher than Tom. That actually made him chuckle. A small, reluctant laugh. Yeah, he admitted, you were. I leaned against the porch railing. Do you remember the time Tom crashed the pickup when he was 17? He nodded. He said the brakes failed. They didn't. My father looked at me. You knew that? I saw him racing down Maple Street before it happened. He frowned. Why didn't you say anything? Because you already believed him. That memory seemed to settle into him. He stared out toward the quiet street. A car passed slowly at the end of the block. Then he asked another question. How did you afford the house? Retirement savings, I said, some consulting money. That must have been a lot. It was enough. He shook his head slowly. You spent your own money fixing a mess you didn't create. Yes. Why? I answered the same way I had at the table. Because it's still home. But this time he didn't just hear the words. He understood them. For the first time all evening, his shoulders sagged slightly. "I thought Tom was the one looking after us," he said quietly. "He tried," I replied. That wasn't entirely a lie. Tom had always meant well. But good intentions don't always pay mortgages. My father looked back toward the house. The porch light glowed warmly through the front window. Inside we could see silhouettes moving around the kitchen. "Your whole life you think you understand your family. And then one evening pulls the curtain back. I was proud when you joined the Marines," he said suddenly. "That surprised me. You never said that." He shrugged. "Didn't seem like something you needed to hear. Everyone needs to hear it sometimes." He nodded slowly. "You were the first miller to wear that uniform," he said. "I know. I told people at the plant about you." I blinked. "You did. Every chance I got." That hit me harder than the insult at dinner. Because pride that goes unspoken can feel exactly like the opposite. "I wish you'd said that to me," I said. He stared at the ground for a moment. Then he said something very quietly. "I should have." The words hung between us. Years ago I might have demanded more. An apology. A full explanation. But age teaches patience. Sometimes the first step is enough. He took a deep breath. "So," he said, "what happens now?" I thought about that. About the house. About Tom. About the family that had almost broken apart at the dinner table. "You and Mom stay here," I said. "Nothing changes." "And the house? It stays in the family." He looked at me. "You're serious?" "Yes." A long pause passed. Then he said something that felt almost like surrender. I judged the wrong child. I didn't answer right away. Because sometimes silence says more than words. Finally I spoke. "It's not too late to fix that." He nodded slowly. The porch door opened behind us. My mother stepped out onto the porch. "You two coming back inside?" she asked gently. My father looked at me. "Then back at the house?" "Yeah," he said. And for the first time that night his voice sounded softer than I'd ever heard it. We stood there for another moment before walking back toward the porch. The screen door creaked the same way it always had. I must have heard that sound 10,000 times growing up. Funny how some noises stay exactly the same even when everything else changes. Inside the house was quieter now. The plates had been cleared from the dining table. My Aunt Carol and my mother were in the kitchen packing leftovers into plastic containers the way families do after every Thanksgiving meal. Tom sat alone at the table. His glass of wine was still half full, but he hadn't touched it. When my father and I stepped inside, Tom looked up. His expression was different now. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it had lost some of its certainty. My father pulled out his chair and sat down slowly. For a moment nobody spoke. Then my mother turned around from the kitchen. "Frank," she said softly, "do you want some coffee?" He nodded. "Yeah." She poured a cup and set it in front of him. The smell of coffee filled the room. I sat down across from Tom. He leaned back in his chair and stared at me. "So what now?" he asked. His voice wasn't as sharp as before, just tired. I folded my hands on the table. "What do you mean?" "You bought the house," he said. "You made your point." "That wasn't the point." "Sure it wasn't." My father looked up. "Tom." Tom sighed. "Look, I know I messed up." The words came out awkwardly like they weren't used to being spoken. I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed. "That's usually how trouble starts," my father said. Tom nodded reluctantly. "Yeah." My mother sat down beside him. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked gently. Tom stared at the table. "Because I thought I could handle it. By borrowing against the house." He didn't answer. My father took a slow sip of coffee. "You're not a bad man, Tom," he said. Tom looked up. "But you've been living like tomorrow always fixes today," my father continued. Tom let out a quiet breath. "I know." The room felt different now. Less like a battlefield. More like the aftermath. Finally, Tom looked at me again. "So what happens to the house?" I answered simply. "You and Mom and Dad keep living here." Tom frowned. "And you?" "I have my place in Columbus." "So you're just letting it sit here?" "Not exactly." My father leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" I reached into the folder again and pulled out another document. "This is a family trust agreement," I said. Tom blinked. "You made a trust?" "Yes." My father adjusted his glasses and looked at the paper. "What does it say?" It says the house belongs to the Miller Family Trust, I explained. My mother tilted her head. A trust. That means the house stays protected. No one can borrow against it again. No risky loans, no surprise foreclosures. Tom stared at the document. So none of us can sell it. Not without everyone agreeing. My father read through the first page slowly. Then he nodded. That's actually pretty smart. Tom rubbed the back of his neck. So basically you marine-proofed the house. I almost smiled. Something like that. My mother looked at me with tears in her eyes again. You did all this for us. Yes. Even after tonight. I shrugged gently. Tonight doesn't erase 40 years. My father set the paperwork down. I owe you an apology, he said. The room grew quiet again. My father had never been a man who apologized easily. He turned toward me. Calling you dead weight was wrong. I didn't say anything. He continued. You've done more for this family than I realized. Tom nodded slightly. Yeah, that's true. The words sounded strange coming from him. But they were honest. My father looked at both of us. You know, he said slowly, when I was your age, my father used to say something. What Tom asked. He said pride makes a man stubborn, but humility makes him wiser. Tom chuckled. So which one are you right now? My father smiled faintly. Still working on it. For the first time that evening, the tension in the room softened. My Aunt Carol returned from the kitchen carrying a pie. Well, she said cheerfully, if we're done arguing, I'm not letting this pumpkin pie go to waste. That finally broke the silence. Tom laughed. Now that's the best news all night. We moved back to the table again. Plates were passed around. Coffee was poured. Outside, the wind had died down and the house felt warmer than it had earlier. At one point, my father looked at me across the table. You know something, he said. What's that? You're the one who carried this family. I shook my head. No, Dad. Then who did? All of us, I said. He considered that for a moment, then nodded. Later that night, as everyone prepared to leave, my father walked me to the porch. The same porch where we had talked earlier. He looked out toward the quiet street. You know, he said, families make mistakes. That's true. But the important thing is fixing them before it's too late. I looked back at the house. At the light glowing in the kitchen window. At my mother laughing with my aunt inside. It's not too late, I said. He nodded. No, it isn't. And for the first time in a very long time, the house on Maple Street felt like a home again. The weeks after Thanksgiving moved more quietly than I expected. For most of my life, big family moments had always been followed by long stretches of silence. Arguments were something the Miller family buried under routine. You said something sharp, people got hurt, and then everyone pretended the weather had caused it. But this time felt different. 3 days after Thanksgiving, my father called me. That alone was unusual. Growing up, the phone calls usually went the other direction. My mother called, my aunt called, Tom called when he needed help moving furniture or borrowing tools. My father wasn't a phone person. So when I saw his name on my screen that Monday morning, I sat there for a moment before answering. Hello. Sarah. His voice sounded the same as always, firm, steady. But there was something else in it too. Morning, Dad. You busy? Just paperwork. You mind if I ask you something? Go ahead. There was a pause. The kind that tells you someone is choosing their words carefully. I've been looking over that trust document you left, he said. What do you think? I think I should have talked to a lawyer years ago. That made me smile a little. You weren't the only one. He cleared his throat. You really made it so nobody can borrow against the house again. Yes. No refinancing without everyone agreeing. That's right. Another pause. Well, he said slowly, that's probably the smartest thing anyone's done with this place in 40 years. Coming from my father, that was about the closest thing to high praise you could get. How's Mom? I asked. She's good, already planning Christmas. Of course she is. And Tom? He hesitated again. What about Tom? He started meeting with a financial advisor. That surprised me. That's good. Yeah, my father said. He's trying. That was all he said about it. But it was enough. A couple of weeks later, I drove back to Maple Street. Not for Thanksgiving this time. Just a Saturday visit. The town looked the same as always. The diner on Main Street still had the same faded sign. The hardware store still smelled like sawdust and motor oil. Some places don't change much over time. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, my father was raking leaves. The old maple tree had dropped most of them. He leaned on the rake when he saw me. "Well, look who's back," he said. "Just checking on the property," I replied with a grin. He snorted. Landlord humor. I walked over and grabbed the spare rake leaning against the garage. For a while we worked side by side in the yard. No big speeches. Just the quiet rhythm of rakes moving through dry leaves. After a few minutes, he said something without looking at me. "You know, I told a couple guys at the hardware store about you." "Oh." "About the marine thing, buying the house." "What did they say?" He shrugged. "Said I must have done something right raising you." I raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them they were probably right." We kept raking. A truck drove slowly past the house tires, crunching over the gravel road. Then he said something else. I also told them something I should have said a long time ago. "What's that?" "That I'm proud of you." The words landed gently. Not dramatic, just honest. I set the rake down. "Thank you," I said. He nodded once. Then we went back to work. Inside the house, my mother was in the kitchen baking cookies. The smell hit me the second I opened the door. "Sarah," she said happily. She hugged me like she always did, flour still on her hands. "You look thinner," she added immediately. "That's impossible," I laughed. Tom walked in from the living room a minute later. He looked different. Not physically. Just quieter. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He leaned against the counter. I wanted to say something. "Okay. I'm sorry." The words came out quickly, like he'd been practicing them. "For the loan," he continued. "For the house. For how I acted at dinner." I nodded. "I appreciate that." "I'm working on getting things straight," he said. "New job starting next month." "What kind?" "Project manager for a construction company." "That sounds promising." He shrugged. "It's steady." Then he gave a small smile. "And the financial advisor says I'm banned from real estate deals for at least 5 years. That might be wise." We both laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh that erases the past, but it was the kind that helps you move forward. Later that afternoon, we all sat on the porch together. The same porch swing my father built decades ago creaked gently as the wind moved through the yard. The maple tree stood tall beside the driveway, just like it always had. My father leaned back in his chair. "You know something," he said. "What's that?" my mother asked. "I always thought strength meant holding everything together by yourself." He looked at me. "But sometimes strength means letting someone else help." Nobody argued with that, because by that point we all understood it. Families aren't perfect. They bend. They break. But if you're lucky, they also find ways to repair themselves. Before I left that evening, my father walked me to my car. He rested one hand on the roof as I opened the door. "You coming back for Christmas?" he asked. "Of course." "Good." He nodded toward the house. "Wouldn't feel right without you here." I looked back at the porch. At the kitchen window glowing warmly behind the curtains. At the place that had shaped every part of my life, even the difficult parts. "I'll always come back," I said. Then I paused. And before I got in the car, I turned to him and added something I'd learned through all of this. "Sometimes the quiet people carry the heaviest loads," I said. He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "They do." If this story reminded you of someone in your own family, someone who carried more than anyone noticed, maybe tonight is a good time to tell them. Sometimes the strongest thing we can do isn't proving someone wrong. It's choosing to keep the family together anyway. And if stories like this mean something to you, feel free to share them with someone who might need to hear it. Because every family has its hard chapters. But the best ones always leave room for another page.